Good afternoon. Welcome back to Passion World Talk Radio Network, Global Media Network LLC, owns PWR Network. And today on Lest We Forget Historical, we are going to continue with the problem of a low birth decline in the United States from two different perspectives with your host, Lillian Cauldwell. So the first one that we were talking about was from immigration and the fact that immigration makes it easier for the U.S. to keep up our birth rate, not only for kids being born, but also to keep our market going, because without people who are working or without people paying for supplies that they need, and they're all types in the 21st century, then we have no economy at all, and we would be considered a third world country. So think about that. And as the article goes on to say, immigration is going to be a factor that will offset the low fertility rate that we have at the moment. For programs such as Social Security, another important factor is the ratio of workers to retirees. If there aren't enough workers paying into the system on a consistent basis, it makes it more difficult for the programs to stay solvent, something we're already having a problem with, folks. Immigrants typically enter the country at a younger age and so are able to contribute to the programs for decades, Gaukhale said. That's Gokhale. More people and more workers means more tax revenue. He goes on to say that means benefits to retirees will be funded better. Fewer immigrants and fewer workers means it will be more difficult to fund these programs. Something to think about in addition to that wall. And that's not to say anything about the economic growth of our country. More people means more productivity and higher gross domestic product. In the most recent outlook from the Congressional Budget Office, economists say that rising immigration would increase the growth rate of gross domestic product by 0.2% throughout the next decade by increasing the available labor force. That's $7 trillion in growth over the next decade generated by immigration, equating to $1 trillion in tax revenue. So I understand why the wall must be necessary to keep the bad people out, but to kill the baby with the bathwater doesn't seem to make too much sense to me. Everything is relative. There's long economics literature that document the benefits that immigrants have to the economy, said Tara Watson, an economist who studies immigration at the center-left Brookings Institute. Quote, immigrants create demand as well as supply in labor. They demand goods and services and provide growth. And while Watson said that it's difficult to track exactly how many immigrants are paying into our tax system due to the illegal nature of much of the immigration, she said most immigrants in the most recent surge at the border had work permits, and thus were putting money into the government coffers. There's not a close tie between reduced immigration and a possible spike in inflation, as some liberal commentators have tried to say. Instead, reduced immigration impacts decrease the demands for goods and services while also decreasing the available labor supply, making it difficult to say if reduced immigration would spike prices. If immigration does decline under a second Trump presidency, Sciubba, Sciubba, said that, quote, the economic and social impacts of an aging and shrinking population or the threat of one might quickly surface as a contentious issue. What's on my radar is if immigration falls, but there's a growing awareness about population aging and low fertility, what are the government policies that follow to encourage more births? She said she was watching closely the possibility of policy limiting access to contraceptives. Elon Musk's support said nationalism and the possible political backlash if politicians pursue pro-natalist, natalist policies. And those policies might not lead to more births, but they'll lead to a more fractured America. Now, the other thing one must take into consideration is that if the children have a mental illness or they're birthed with cancer or physical defects, then you're going to have a problem as well. On that same note, another article states that the U.S. fertility rate hit a record low in 2020, just as it did in 2019 and 2018. Although COVID-19 pandemic seems to have accelerated the decline, the drop has been underway for years. The total fertility rate, the average number of children a woman is expected to have over her lifetime, now sits as 1.64 children per woman in the U.S. Not only is this the lowest rate recorded since the government began tracking these stats in the 1930s, but it's well below the so-called, quote, replacement level fertility, unquote, of about 2.1. The latter number is what social scientists and policymakers have long regarded as the rate a country should maintain to keep population numbers stable. When the fertility rate falls below replacement level, the population grows older and shrinks, which can slow economic growth and strain government budgets. Today's babies are tomorrow's workers and taxpayers. They'll not only staff the hospitals and nursing homes we'll use in old age, but also sustain the economy by funding our pensions when we retire, paying the taxes that finance Social Security, Medicare, and many other government programs we rely on, and buying the homes and stocks we invest to build our savings. But recently, some experts have questioned whether we ought to be so concerned about low fertility. There's nothing really magical about replacement level fertility, said Eric Stressing, a professor of demography, and sustainable development at the University of Vienna. There are ways to overcome the challenges of low fertility, but it takes an investment in the people who have been born already. The concept of replacement level fertility goes back to at least 1929. At the time, birth rates in the U.S. and other industrialized countries had been falling for decades, and people didn't know why. Attempting to explain this problem, the American demographer Warren Thompson theorized that as these countries industrialize, people gain access to better medicine and sanitation, as well as safer drinking water, leading to a sharp drop in death rates. With more children surviving to adulthood, people eventually started having fewer kids. In the final stage of this transition, Thompson proposed the fertility rate was settled at just about replacement level when the one baby born for every adult dying. Thompson's prediction was purely theoretical, but it became a foundation to the field of demography, demography, when the United Nations Population Division began projecting world population in the 1960s. Its estimates were based on Thompson's assumption that fertility rates across the world would converge to replacement level, further cementing the concept into demographic thought. The idea was attractive to politicians and policymakers since it meant they wouldn't have to worry about populations growing. are shrinking indefinitely. They could count on new generations of workers and taxpayers to keep the economy humming and government programs funded when older people stop working. So that should give you an idea, and we will wrap the rest of this up next week. Thank you very much for listening. You can hear this at youtube.com/PWR Network, PW Talk Radio, over at https://passionateworldtalkradio.com/blog, and all of our social media, facebook.com/Passionate World Radio. And please don't be a stranger. Come in and take a good look. I thank you for joining us this afternoon. I hope you have a great weekend. Ruby AI is sponsoring this program, lest we forget historical. https://esc73.tryrubyai or tryruby.ai. And also the podcast obstacle training course, where you can find and sign up at https://education.passionateworldtalkradio.com. Thank you and have a great weekend.